Oh, hey there friends, Katie here from Shangri-La Gardens. Since you're not able to come to us, we wanted to come to you. Today we're going to be talking all about trees. So before we get started talking about trees and learning some ways to identify them, I want to remind you about the parts of a tree. Now I know you all have heard this before. So that part that's underground that we can really not see, but sometimes we can occasionally see if it comes above the ground, that is the roots. That's the part of the tree that absorbs the water and the nutrients. The second part is the trunk. That's this big sturdy part. And then we have its branches. Those are what comes off of the trunk. Its leaves, which you can see all over this beautiful tree. And if it's a tree that produces a fruit or a cone, you'll have the fruit as the final last piece. Roots are the part of the tree that are usually found underground. One case though, when this is maybe not true, is with our cypress trees, which I'll point out later to you. So the job of the roots is to not only anchor the tree to the ground, but also to uptake water and nutrients from the soil. The trunk of the tree, as you know, is covered with a protective coating called the bark. Now, the bark is made up of something called phloem, and the wood part of the tree is made up of something called xylem. Now, phloem is the vascular tissue of the plant that conducts the sugars and other metabolic products down from the leaves. The xylem is a vascular tissue part of the plant that conducts water and dissolved nutrients upward from the root and helps form the woody part of the trunk. The leaves of a tree are green most of the time, but they can come in many colors, shapes, and sizes. The leaves take in the sunlight and use the water and food from the roots to make the tree grow and reproduce. Leaves perform that important process that the tree needs in order to grow, called photosynthesis, where it's making food from sun. When we're talking about leaves today, there are two broad categories. The first one is the broadleaf. And that's a leaf that looks like this. It might belong to an oak or to a maple. And the next broad category is called a conifer. And that is a needle-like leaf. Now, conifers typically bear cones that protect their seeds, while broadleaves typically bear fruits. We've had a quick reminder about the different parts of a tree, its roots, the trunk, the branches, its leaves, and its fruits. We talked about the difference between a broadleaf tree and a needle leaf tree. Now come with me on an adventure through Shangri-La as I point out some of the really common trees that I know you've seen before. The first tree we're going to stop and take a look at is one I know you've seen before, the magnolia. If you look at these magnolia leaves, it has really smooth edges. It's a dark green and kind of a red rust color underneath, and it's a very thick, waxy leaf. That's because the magnolia is an evergreen tree, meaning it doesn't lose its leaves. It's evergreen all year. The second tree we're going to look at on our adventure is the swamp chestnut oak. If you look at the leaves of the swamp chestnut oak, they're slightly lobed. They start out narrow at the base, get bigger, and then come to a point on the end. Now, the swamp chestnut oak is different from the magnolia. Remember, the magnolia was an evergreen, meaning it was evergreen all year. But the swamp chestnut oak is a deciduous tree, meaning it loses its leaves in the winter. Now, one way that it might help you to remember deciduous, it decides to lose its leaves. Our next tree is the longleaf yellow pine. Now, the longleaf yellow pine is unique in the sense that it used to cover all of southeast Texas into Louisiana. These trees are very slow growing. They don't mature until they're about 100 to 150 years old, so it takes a long time. Another interesting fact about these longleaf yellow pines is that they actually go through phases, and it takes several years before the trunk becomes the size that we see it today. Now, I told you longleaf yellow pines take 100 to 150 years to mature. How would we know, this is a bonus question, how do we know how old a tree is? That's right, we count the rings. But let me ask you this. What if we don't cut it down? I'll tell you how we figure it out. A scientist called a dendrochronologist uses a tool called an increment borer, and it's a long skinny tool about the width of a pencil, and they actually drill it into the tree. They get a core sample, they pull it out, then they're able to count the rings. They can then put it back, replace the core sample, and the tree will heal itself. So that is how we can tell how old trees are. This tree is one of the most easily identifiable trees that you'll find down here in Southeast Texas. It has a leaf that's shaped like a star. That's right, the sweetgum. This tree has those brown seed pods that I know you've probably stepped on in your bare feet, and they're kind of spiky. This is called the sweetgum. Okay friends, the last tree we're going to identify on our adventure today is one that's very common throughout the swamps of Southeast Texas, the bald cypress. You can tell it's a bald cypress because it has a flat, feathery needle leaf. Now, the bald cypress is also deciduous, meaning it loses its leaves in the winter. Now, a lot of times there's some confusion about a tree that might be a conifer, that it's also an evergreen, meaning it keeps its leaves all year, but that's not necessarily true. The bald cypress is a conifer, a cone-bearing plant, but it's also deciduous, meaning it loses its leaves in the wintertime. Another easy way that you can tell a tree is a bald cypress is because of its roots. Now, I mentioned earlier when we were talking about roots that some trees have roots above the ground. The bald cypress is one of those trees. These are common all along the swamps in Southeast Texas. They're called cypress knees. As we wrap up our adventure today, we've learned a lot of different information about trees. And believe me, this is just the tip of the iceberg. If you're interested in tree identification or learning more about trees, an excellent investment would be a good field guide to help you learn how to identify the trees and what to look for. So we talked about basic parts of our trees: the roots, the trunk, the branches, the leaves, and the fruits. Then we went out, we talked about different trees that you might find out here at Shangri-La. We identified some of them, so now you can learn how to identify them. We talked about evergreen trees that keep their leaves all year, deciduous trees that lose their leaves, and we even learned how to age a tree. So, challenge time. I challenge you to make your own tree ring. Make each line of that tree represent a year of your life and write down something important that happened there. And a bonus challenge this time, go out into your yard and see if you can identify any of the trees that we showed you out here at Shangri-La. All right, we miss you. We're proud of you. Stay curious.